Hey everyone, and welcome back to our channel. The global stage has been incredibly active lately, with many significant events unfolding. Today, we're going to delve into one of the most critical developments that has been occurring, the situation around Kursk. So, let's get right into it. Putin's gamble in Kursk has spectacularly backfired. For several months, a fierce battle has raged in the Kursk region, where Ukrainian forces initially captured 450 square miles back in August of 2024. Russia, backed by a contingent of 50,000 troops, which also included as many as 12,000 North Korean soldiers sent by Kim Jong-un, launched a counteroffensive and managed to claw back 40% of this territory. Putin hoped that these overseas reinforcements would tip the balance of power in his favor, but they are actually contributing to his woes. Ukraine has shifted from a defensive posture to an aggressive one. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has initiated a daring new counteroffensive that has completely changed the dynamics of the engagement. Through surprise assaults across various fronts, the Ukrainian military is doing much more than simply holding their ground. They're now pushing to reclaim lost territories. This development raises many significant questions. What does this shift mean for Kursk? What is the impact on Putin? And what is the fate of those North Korean troops who were sent into this military meat grinder? We will unpack everything, starting with a look at the most recent headlines. CNN reported on January 6th that Ukraine had launched a series of counteroffensive attacks against Russian positions in Kursk the day before. This news was also verified by Andriy Kovalenko, the head of Ukraine's Center for Countering Disinformation, who told the media that surprise assaults were being launched across the entire border region. Much as it did with its initial foray into Kursk in August of 2024, Ukraine hoped this element of surprise would catch the Russian forces so off guard that they would be obliged to relinquish control of some of the territory. There is some indication that this strategy may be proving successful. On January 5th, Andriy Yermak, the head of the Ukrainian presidential office, posted a short message on Telegram. Kursk region, good news, Russia is getting what it deserves. Though he offered no further particulars, his statement suggests that the Ukrainians have achieved at least some success during their most recent counteroffensive and intend to capitalize on their initial achievements. Conversely, the Russian Defense Ministry sent a much different message. While Yermak celebrated the valor of Ukrainian soldiers who had participated in the counteroffensive and their presumed victories, Russia asserted it had successfully repelled the Ukrainian attacks. A statement from the Defense Ministry claimed that Russia had taken decisive steps, supported by artillery and air power. This action purportedly led to the obliteration of main Ukrainian forces who had amassed in the village of Berdyn, a location only 9 miles from the Ukrainian border, as they prepared for the counteroffensive. The ministry claimed that Russia had prevented the Ukrainian armed forces from breaking through, thus implying that Yermak's telegram post was a falsehood. The question that remains is, who is actually telling the truth? At this juncture, it is hard to say. CNN stated that they could not verify any of the battlefield reports relating to Ukraine's newest counteroffensive. However, we may be able to gain more insight by examining some of the Russian blogs that have been posting about these attacks. CNN has noted that multiple of these blogs acknowledged the combat on January 5th and affirmed that Ukrainian forces were moving northwards in an effort to penetrate the defenses in Berdyn. One blogger declared that Ukraine had thrown its reserves into the latest Kursk counteroffensive. This blog also pointed out that the Ukrainians had taken a rather intelligent approach to the counterattack. The blog states that, for the breakthrough, the armed forces of Ukraine covered the area with strong radio-electronic warfare systems, hindering the functionality of Russian unmanned aerial vehicles, while admitting that Russian tanks and artillery are actively working against the enemy. The blogger added that the majority of battles were occurring between small arms. Another Russian blog stated that the fighting had originated in the direction of Sudzha, and that Ukraine had also deployed paratroopers into the area as support for their fighters. In this assault, the enemy used mine clearance devices, tanks, as well as other armored vehicles, the blogger claimed. Therefore, what we can say with assurance is that the counteroffensive is now fully underway. The use of the phrase breakthrough by the first Russian blogger indicates that Ukraine has enjoyed significantly more success than the Russian Defense Ministry would have people believe. Okay, folks, I need to pause here for a second. If you're enjoying the content and getting some good info out of it, please give the video a like. It really helps the channel out. Also, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future updates. We have a lot more of this to come. We would also love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you are tuning in from. And please stick around to the end because we'll be drawing some crucial conclusions at the end of the video. Further information about this counteroffensive came from a variety of other sources. In its coverage of the Ukrainian assaults, The Guardian released footage of armored units as they navigated snow-covered fields en route to a town called Bolshu Soldatskoy. Located northeast of Sudzha, this town seems to be a secondary objective for the Ukrainians, suggesting that their counteroffensive has been initiated on several fronts. The Ukrainian General Staff confirmed this idea and claimed that there were 42 combat clashes on January 5th, with a dozen of those clashes continuing into the next day. The Guardian also cited unverified accounts that suggested Ukrainian troops had entered Berdyn, as well as a separate small town called Novosotnitsky. The Guardian further verified that Ukraine had utilized electronic countermeasures to take down Russian drones and that there were active sappers in the Kursk region who were removing Russian mines. These are not the kinds of reports that would be coming out if the Russian Defense Ministry's claim that they had repelled the Ukrainian counteroffensive was actually accurate. And Ukraine is definitely applying pressure. In the Kursk region, the Russians are deeply concerned, Andriy Kovalenko claimed on January 5th. They were attacked on several fronts, which took them by surprise. This is not the single assault near Berdyn, which Russia has been attempting to portray as the full extent of the counteroffensive. Instead, Ukraine is engaging in combat in many locations, with battles continuing in numerous places and the possibility of successful reclamation of territory in others. There are also suggestions that Ukraine may be using weaponry produced in Britain during this counteroffensive. In its coverage of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, The Telegraph noted that reports from various military bloggers suggested that the combat was both severe and, at times, a little confused. These bloggers state that among the armored columns that Ukraine sent into the assaults were British Challenger 2 tanks. The Telegraph could not verify those reports. However, if they are indeed accurate, Russia will have a major piece of equipment to deal with. The Challenger 2 tank is a stalwart of the British Army, having seen combat in various engagements including Kosovo, Iraq, and Bosnia. The first one was built in 1986, and this 4-person crewed tank is one of the most cutting-edge that has seen combat in the Ukraine war. It has a primary L-30A 120mm rifled gun that can hold 47 rounds, along with a 7.62mm L-94A one-chain gun that can unleash a frightening rate of fire. Despite its weight of 62.5 tons, more when it's loaded with its crew, the tank is surprisingly quick and can travel as fast as 36.6 miles per hour. If Ukraine is using these assets in Kursk, it implies they are serious about taking back at least a portion of the territory they lost to Russia's own counteroffensive. The question becomes, why is Ukraine launching this counteroffensive at this precise moment? A portion of the response has to do with the circumstances in Kursk when Ukraine started its counteroffensive. According to The Guardian, the freezing winter conditions in the region have made it difficult for the Russian ground forces to advance. But these same conditions have actually made it easier for Ukrainian armored units to progress. Besides the Challenger 2 tank, which the Telegraph reports Ukraine is deploying, there are also accounts of the Ukrainian army using Bradley fighting vehicles in their advance. These vehicles are used to quickly transport troops to their locations. In contrast, Russia has been sending their infantry and North Korean troops to attack Ukrainian positions on foot. This gives Ukraine a clear advantage in mobility. It is launching its counteroffensive now because a large number of the Russian troops are bogged down in snow and ice. This makes the Russians less responsive to the situation. Speaking of the North Korean troops and the Ukrainian advantage, there's another aspect that factors into Ukraine's decision to launch a counterattack at this time, and it revolves around the Russian casualty rates in Kursk. Our previous comment about Russia sending their soldiers to assault Ukrainian positions on foot hints at the strategy Putin has been relying on throughout his Kursk counteroffensive. And it is the exact same tactic that he's employing in Ukraine. He's sending wave after wave of cannon fodder at Ukrainian fortifications with the hope of depleting enemy resources. These assaults have led to the expected outcome. Ukraine claims that it has caused 38,000 casualties among Russian forces during the 5 months between the initial Kursk invasion and the current counteroffensive. 15,000 Russian troops have reportedly died in battle, while another 23,000 have been injured. As if playing a game of tit-for-tat, Russia retaliated by releasing numbers that were meant to exceed the Ukrainian total and claimed to have inflicted 49,010 troop casualties in Kursk during this same period. They offered no details on how many were killed versus wounded, and this seems to be a very high number, considering that Russia often tries to downplay these figures when talking about the Ukrainian troops in Kursk. Russia is also losing a lot of the soldiers that they have received from North Korean President Kim Jong-un as part of their mutual defense treaty with the Asian nation. Earlier, we talked about the fact that Kim sent up to 12,000 of his soldiers, many of whom are thought to be from North Korea's elite Storm Corps, to Russia in October of 2024. Zelenskyy confirmed this figure when he spoke to Lex Fridman's podcast in January of 2025. He also stated that Ukraine had either killed or wounded 3,800 North Korean soldiers. This means that approximately a third of the whole contingent that Kim had dispatched has been dealt with, showing us that Ukraine has had a lot of success against Putin's main ally. Zelenskyy further noted that Ukraine had obliterated a full battalion that was mostly comprised of North Korean troops in the 2 days leading up to January 4th. This suggests that Kim's troops are experiencing extremely high casualty rates. Why does this even matter in the context of Ukraine's Kursk counteroffensive? It is all related to numbers. Ukraine has been steadily diminishing the force of 50,000 troops Putin dispatched into Kursk to reclaim the area. This brave defense has left Russia in a weakened state. With fewer troops at their disposal to launch assaults, Russian pressure may be easing, thus allowing Ukraine the opportunity to launch counterattacks. Currently, there are gaps in the Russian front lines, or at least in locations where there are a greater number of scattered troops when compared to those with stronger defenses. Ukraine has most likely used the information about the Russian casualty rate to recognize where they are most vulnerable and struck Putin where it would hurt the most. Putin had hoped his human wave tactics would breach Ukraine's defenses, but instead, he's weakened his own and has presented his enemy with additional opportunities. Ukraine has successfully capitalized on these opportunities and seems to be making inroads into many of the villages and towns that were lost during Russia's initial Kursk offensive. But there is more to consider. Ukraine is also keeping track of a major event that is set to occur around the middle of January, the inauguration of President-elect Donald Trump. Trump was also a topic of discussion during Zelenskyy's interview with Fridman. Ukraine's leader pointed out that Trump's security promises could put an end to the Ukraine conflict, but this is only if Trump follows through on what he says. Zelenskyy also hinted at the idea that Trump seems to have adequate leverage over Putin to at the very least force a ceasefire in the Russian leader's so-called special military operation. For his part, Trump has claimed that he'll conclude the conflict within days of assuming office. His rather vague peace plan is probably the biggest card that America's incoming president has to play. Zelenskyy is well aware of this. He told Fridman that, "Trump and I will come to an agreement and provide strong security guarantees, together with Europe, and then we will be able to talk to the Russians." Whether Ukraine's leader truly believes this is not entirely clear. After all, on December 30th, he had told French President Emmanuel Macron that Ukraine needs to be realistic about the territorial problems it is facing, and that there would be no quick and easy way to bring an end to this war. The key phrase here is territorial problems, as they relate to Ukraine's most recent counteroffensive. There are many ideas surrounding what Trump's plan will look like. Yet, one of the most popular ideas is that a massive demilitarized zone will be established along the 745-mile front line in the Ukraine war. European troops, like soldiers from Poland, Germany, Britain, and France, would be responsible for patrolling the area, with the US taking more of a hands-off approach. Both Ukraine and Russia would have to agree to the terms of the ceasefire, and this demilitarized zone would prevent either party from attacking the other. From this point, discussions would begin, and negotiations would most likely revolve around the territory each nation currently has. Russia presently controls about a fifth of Ukraine, with the majority of this territory being located in the south and east of the country. Putin's push in Donetsk, which we will get to shortly, may lead to Russia taking control of even more territory by the time that Trump takes office. As for Ukraine, it has Kursk as leverage, which it can use to recover a portion of the territory that Russia has overran during Putin's special military operation. Therefore, another reason for Ukraine's Kursk counteroffensive becomes more apparent. Despite the large number of soldiers Putin has lost in his efforts to retake Kursk, he has seen some measure of success. As we mentioned before, Russia has already recovered about 40% of what it lost during the Ukrainian invasion in August of 2024. Ukraine's counteroffensive is an attempt to recover at least some of the lost territory so that they have as much leverage as possible when Trump brings them to the table with Russia. Furthermore, Kursk holds great value for Putin. Although smaller in terms of the amount of territory Russia has taken from Ukraine, Kursk is significant because it marks the first time that Russia has been successfully invaded since the Second World War. Leaving Kursk in the hands of the Ukrainians would be a huge embarrassment for Putin, even if it meant trading it for a bigger portion of Ukrainian territory. He may well be willing to trade more Ukrainian territory than he gets in return to soothe his embarrassment over Kursk. Zelenskyy will be counting on that. This is one of the reasons that Ukraine is now pushing to take back territory in Kursk. He is creating pressure for Putin. And this brings us to another reason why Ukraine has chosen to launch a counterattack in Kursk now. Robert Clark, a fellow at the Yorktown Institute, a U.S. think tank, confirms that Ukraine plans to use any territory it holds in Kursk as a bargaining chip during any future negotiations. However, he also points out that Putin has staked his personal reputation on the success or failure of Russia's current efforts in Kursk. Clark says that Ukraine's latest move will mean a huge deal more to Putin than it will to Trump in the context of any peace negotiations. Putin has spent the Christmas period telling the people of Russia that he will return all of Kursk to Russian control. So, for Putin and for Russia, the ability to maintain control over Kursk is going to be far more important than it will be to President Trump in the future. Again, this is all linked to the embarrassment factor that we mentioned earlier. Putin is facing pressure from his own people, and quite possibly other forces within the Kremlin, who see the loss of Kursk as a sign of his own weakness. When Ukraine is both actively retaking territory and defending the territory it still controls, the reclamation of the Russian land that was lost becomes a whole lot harder. Alex Cadier, an international correspondent at Times Radio, agrees. He says that Ukraine's counteroffensive flies in the face of the narrative of the last few months in which Russia has been slowly recapturing territory in Kursk. And again, this puts more pressure on Putin. It proves to him that, even with a large advantage in manpower provided by the North Korean troops, the Ukrainian forces still have the ability to punch back. Cadier claims that these heavy punches will add even more pressure onto Putin. Cadier is referring to the Ukrainian counteroffensive when he says, "It's certainly significant in terms of the number of resources that have been committed to it. But also, it will have some significant diplomatic consequences when these ceasefire discussions finally take place." So, it all seems to have worked out quite well for Ukraine. The winter conditions have given them the mobility advantage they needed to launch the counteroffensive in the first place. The high number of Russian and North Korean casualties has only added to this advantage, creating gaps that Ukraine is now exploiting. And with the inauguration of Donald Trump soon to take place, Ukraine is doing all it can to take back territory and to put more pressure on an already weakened Putin. This is impacting his domestic standing and his position in any upcoming peace talks. But that's not the only thing happening. There is also the matter of Donetsk to consider. While all of the fighting in Kursk is going on, Russia is also pushing hard to claim as much territory in Ukraine's east as it possibly can. In terms of acquiring territory, Putin's troops are advancing through the region at the fastest rate they have managed since the start of the initial invasion in February of 2022. They are on the verge of flanking the Donetsk city of Pokrovsk and have forced the Ukrainian military to abandon a number of key defensive positions, including an underground stronghold in a damaged thermal power plant that the Ukrainians have been defending for the majority of the war. these advancements will not have gone unnoticed by Zelenskyy. In fact, some commentators have even criticized Ukraine's actions in Kursk, and this criticism is likely to intensify as the counteroffensive continues. These critics argue that Ukraine would be better off committing the troops it is stationed in Kursk to the defense of Donetsk, thus slowing the Russian advance. However, Oleksandr Syrsky, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian military, disagrees. He claims that the whole operation in Kursk has forced Russia to divert troops that would have otherwise been sent to Donetsk. By launching its counteroffensive in Kursk, Ukraine hopes to keep those troops occupied and possibly push Moscow into sending even more there. This may help to stem the losses in Donetsk, while the Ukrainians reclaim portions of Kursk. The most important question now is, will Ukraine's Kursk counteroffensive ultimately succeed? It is still somewhat early to tell, as the operation is ongoing. However, Ukraine has not been all that successful with its counteroffensives during Putin's special military operation. In the summer of 2023, Ukraine attempted a counteroffensive in the south and east of Ukraine in an effort to take back some of the land that had been captured during the initial invasion. That counteroffensive stalled, resulting in the failure to cut off the connection between Russian-controlled Crimea and the Ukrainian mainland. Could this counteroffensive in Kursk suffer the same fate? It is possible, although the circumstances are considerably different. In the summer of 2023, Ukraine spent a number of months building up the forces and weaponry it would need to launch its counteroffensive. This gave the Russians enough time to prepare, and the Russian forces were able to develop layered defenses along the front line. Trenches and mines were strategically placed, which in turn slowed the Ukrainian attack to a crawl, allowing Russia to mostly defend its captured territory. That is not what is happening during Ukraine's Kursk counteroffensive. This time, the Ukrainians have launched surprise attacks. Just as it did in the summer of 2023, the Ukrainian army is still attacking various points along the front line, but this time it's doing so without giving the Russian forces a chance to prepare. Ukraine is also attacking while Russia is in mid-attack itself. This completely eliminates the defensive mindset that allowed Putin's forces to successfully defend against the summer of 2023 counteroffensive. There is also a possibility that the current Kursk counteroffensive could simply be a diversion. The BBC reports that a few Russian military bloggers have made this very suggestion. For example, Yuri Podolyaka suggested that the current Ukrainian attacks may be drawing the Russian forces away from a bigger attack that is on the horizon. Another Russian blogger named Alexander Kots seems to agree, suggesting that the main attack might be launched elsewhere while Russia is dealing with Ukraine's smaller attacks. Perhaps Ukraine has something bigger in store for Russia. If that is the case, it certainly casts Russian claims of having put down at least portions of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in a new light. Perhaps Russia was meant to have been able to deflect the smaller attacks. Ukraine may be poking the bear and inflicting casualties along the way, while they prepare for a more forceful push against a weakening Russia in Kursk. That all remains to be seen. And now we come to our conclusions that we mentioned at the beginning of the video, so it's time to put all of these developments into perspective, so stick around to find out what we think about all of this. For now, we are really interested in what you think of the Ukrainian Kursk counteroffensive. Is this Ukraine's last-ditch attempt to hold on to land before Trump takes office? Or is there a larger Ukrainian attack on the way? Share your views with us in the comments section, and we would like to thank you all for watching this video. Now, make sure you check out our video about the complete obliteration of the Russian Kalino airbase, or maybe check out this other one instead.